Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. Before he left for the army, we were the picture of happiness. Our little house was always filled with laughter. He was a wonderful husband and father, always present, always attentive. Our two children adored him, and I couldn't imagine a life without him by my side. We had our routines, our traditions, and our little moments that made life feel whole. Every morning, we'd have breakfast together, and every evening, we'd sit down to family dinners. There was always music in the air and joy in our hearts. Our love felt unbreakable, as though nothing could ever tear us apart. But when he decided to join the army, it seemed like just another adventure. I never thought it would lead to the change that was about to unfold. He talked about serving the country, about making a difference, and I supported him. He promised he would return to us, the same man who left, the man we all loved. Little did I know, that promise would slowly fade into oblivion. The decision to enlist didn't come out of the blue. He had been talking about it for months, stirred by a desire to serve, to protect. I knew he had always been passionate about history and military strategy, but I never thought he would go as far as to join the army. At first, I resisted the idea. The thought of him leaving, of our family being split apart, felt impossible. But his excitement was palpable, and I could see how much this meant to him. So, I agreed. I kissed him goodbye, feeling a mix of pride and fear. I never imagined the journey ahead would change him in ways I couldn't comprehend. He told me, over and over, that he'd come back to us, our family. But as the days passed after his departure, I found myself questioning whether things would ever be the same. Could I really live without him by my side every day? How long would we be apart? The uncertainty began to gnaw at me. The first goodbye was the hardest. I stood there, holding our youngest in my arms, watching as he packed his bags. He seemed so sure of himself, so ready. There was a calmness in his eyes that comforted me, even though my heart was breaking inside. I kissed him on the cheek, trying to mask the fear that clouded my mind. He promised to write often and to stay in touch, to come back and pick up where we left off. I tried to be brave, holding back my tears as I waved him off. But as the car drove away, the emptiness in my chest grew. The house felt too quiet. The walls seemed to close in around me. I looked down at our children, trying to keep things normal, trying to reassure them, though I couldn't reassure myself. I thought the worst was over, that it would only be a few months, but I had no idea what lay ahead. The phone calls came sporadically at first, short, sweet messages that I clung to like a lifeline. But as time passed, the calls became less frequent, and the distance between us started to feel like a chasm. Something was changing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it yet. In the beginning, he wrote to me every week, sometimes more. His letters were filled with longing and love, telling me how much he missed us. He spoke of the people he was meeting and the things he was learning, always with a sense of excitement. "I'll be back before you know it," he'd write. "I can't wait to hold you and the kids again." I cherished those letters. They were all I had of him, and they kept me going through the lonely nights. But over time, something shifted in the tone of his words. The excitement began to fade. His letters became shorter, more detached, as though he was losing interest in everything back home. "Everything's fine," he'd say, but the words felt empty, lacking the warmth and affection they once had. There was no mention of how he missed us, or how he was counting down the days until he'd be home. Instead, his focus shifted entirely to his experiences with the army, the training, the battles, and the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. I began to feel like an afterthought. The person I was once so important to seemed to be slipping away with each letter. And yet, I kept writing back, pouring my heart into each word, hoping that somehow, the man I loved was still there. As the months passed, I noticed subtle changes in his letters. They became more focused on his military life and less on the family he had left behind. The stories of his daily routines, the drills, and the people he was meeting replaced the small details of our lives back home. He no longer asked about the kids or how I was coping without him. It was as if he had detached from us. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this just a phase? Was he just going through something difficult that he couldn't put into words? I tried not to jump to conclusions, but the distance between us was growing. I wrote him longer letters, asking how he was, telling him about the kids' school events, about little things I thought he would want to know. But his responses were always so brief, so businesslike. He thanked me for the updates, but never shared much about himself anymore. He used to be so open with me, telling me about his thoughts, his dreams, his hopes for the future. Now, it felt like I was writing to a stranger. I began to wonder if the man I married was still there, buried beneath the layers of military life. It was as though the army had taken something from him, something that could never be returned. When he finally came back after 6 months, I was filled with anticipation. I imagined our reunion would be like in the movies, tearful, joyful, with a tight embrace and promises to never be apart again. But when he stepped off the plane, it wasn't what I expected. There was no rush to greet me, no excited hug. He gave me a brief smile, a half-hearted wave, and then it was like we were strangers, standing in an airport, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. I could see the changes in him immediately. He had lost weight, his once warm eyes now cold and distant. His posture was stiff, rigid, as though he were still in army mode, prepared for something, always on guard. I tried to approach him, to hold his hand, but he pulled away slightly, as though unsure of how to interact with me. The kids rushed to him, but he barely reacted. He didn't pick them up or play with them like he used to. Instead, he stood there, arms at his sides, his mind somewhere far away. I tried to mask my disappointment, but the truth was clear. This wasn't the man who left. I didn't know how to reach him, how to pull him back into our world. It was as if he had already moved on, leaving us behind. That first night back, I expected the warmth we had always shared. I had imagined us sitting down together at the dinner table, sharing stories of the time apart. I pictured him holding me close as we fell asleep, just like old times. But that night was different. He barely spoke. He didn't smile when he saw me. It was as though he was seeing me for the first time. The man who used to shower me with affection and attention now sat across from me, quiet, his gaze distant. When I tried to engage him, to ask him about his time away, he responded with short, mechanical answers. "It's fine," he said. "Just a lot of training." It was as if he was physically present, but mentally somewhere far away. I could sense the tension in the air, the weight of words unsaid. The kids, excited to see their father, tried to talk to him, but he hardly acknowledged them. He didn't ask about their schoolwork, their hobbies, or anything, about their lives. It was as if they, too, were strangers to him. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I realized that something had changed within him. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew it wasn't normal. This wasn't the man I had married, the man who was once so full of life and love. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a deep, aching loneliness. I had missed him, but the person who came back wasn't the one I had hoped for. The days after his return were filled with awkward silences. We tried to fall back into our old routines, but everything felt off. The small, everyday conversations we used to have seemed foreign now. It was as if the connection between us had been severed, and we were trying to make do with threads that no longer fit. I would ask him about his day, about the people he met, but he would give vague, non-committal answers. When I tried to talk about the kids, about things happening at home, he showed little interest. He'd nod absently, as if acknowledging my words but not truly hearing them. His mind was somewhere else, and I had no idea where. I felt a growing distance between us that I couldn't bridge. The love we once shared seemed to have evaporated, replaced by this cold, distant version of him. Every time I tried to reach out, to remind him of the life we had together, it felt like I was hitting a wall. He would say things like, "I'm fine, really, but I knew better." I could see the emptiness in his eyes, the way he was constantly distracted. I tried not to let it get to me, but the loneliness was suffocating. I missed my husband, the man who had been my partner in everything. But the man in front of me wasn't him anymore. And that truth was breaking my heart. Our house used to be full of life, full of laughter. The kids ran around, shouting with excitement, and my husband and I would join in the fun. But now, it was eerily quiet. The once vibrant energy of our home had been replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. He sat in front of the TV, his eyes glued to the screen as he watched documentaries about war, weapons, and military strategy. There was no conversation, no playfulness, no music. I would sit across from him, watching him watch the TV, trying to figure out what had happened to the man I once knew. He didn't seem to notice the emptiness that had settled over the house, or if he did, he didn't care. He was lost in his own world, a world of soldiers, war stories, and the things he had experienced in the army. It was as if he had completely disconnected from the life we had built together. I would try to talk to him, to engage him in conversation, but his responses were short, distracted. I tried not to take it personally, but it was hard not to. I missed him. I missed the way we used to talk, the way he would laugh at my jokes, the way he would hug me when I needed comfort. I missed the way our home used to feel alive with warmth and love. But now, it felt like we were just going through the motions, existing in the same space but living in two different worlds. It started slowly. At first, he bought a few things, a knife, some tactical gear, a few books on military tactics. I thought it was just a phase, a way for him to unwind after the stress of the army. But soon, the collection grew. He started buying more and more weapons, filling our home with rifles, handguns, and ammunition. I couldn't understand it. He had never been interested in weapons before. He was a peaceful man, someone who believed in protecting the family, not using force. But now, it was as though something had awakened in him, and he couldn't stop. The house, once filled with toys and laughter, was now filled with the cold, intimidating presence of weapons. I tried to talk to him about it, tried to understand why he felt the need to arm himself so heavily, but he just shrugged it off. "I'm protecting us," he would say, but I could see the obsession in his eyes. It wasn't about protection anymore. It was about something else. The more he collected, the more he withdrew into himself. His obsession with these weapons became a barrier between us, a wall I couldn't break through. He was no longer the man I knew. He was consumed by this new identity, this new focus, and I was left on the outside, watching as he sank deeper into it. Every time I looked at those weapons, I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. Something was terribly wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, I felt him slipping further away. It wasn't just his obsession with military gear that was driving us apart. It was everything. He no longer laughed at my jokes, or even seemed to enjoy the little things we used to share. I would try to involve him in the kids' activities, in the plans for the house, but his response was always the same. A distant look, a distracted nod, and a retreat into his own world. I couldn't understand what had happened to the man I married. The man who used to come home after work, eager to spend time with me and the kids. The man who would take me out for dinners, just the two of us, because he knew I needed that connection. Now, he was a shell of that person. Every time I asked him what was wrong, he would tell me he was just tired or that he needed some space. But I could tell it wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper, something I couldn't reach. He would sit in silence for hours, staring at the wall or out the window, as though he were somewhere else. His mind was no longer here with us. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring him back. The house that had once felt like a home was now just a building. The laughter of children, the warmth of family, the sounds of daily life. Everything had faded into the background. I tried to fill the silence with music, with conversations, with activities for the kids, but nothing worked. Every time I looked at him, sitting there in his chair, eyes fixed on the TV or his military books, I felt a pang of loss. We were still a family in name, but we were strangers in every other way. The kids missed their father. They could sense the distance between us, the coldness in the air. They would try to get his attention, asking him to play with them, to help with homework, but he was never present. His focus was always elsewhere, either on his gear or his thoughts. It was as though the person I had once known, the one who would drop everything for his family, had disappeared. I couldn't help but feel alone, even though he was physically here. The emptiness in our home was overwhelming, and no matter what I did, I couldn't bring the warmth back. It felt like we were just existing in the same space, moving through the motions without truly living. I tried to talk to him about it, but every conversation turned into a confrontation. He would get defensive, telling me I didn't understand, that I wasn't part of his new world. I was losing him, and it was killing me. It wasn't just about the weapons anymore. His obsession with the military was consuming him. It wasn't enough to simply read about it or watch documentaries. He began to talk about enlisting for another tour, about going back to the front lines. He would stay up late at night, reading about battles, tactics, and strategies. It was as though his mind had become entirely consumed with the idea of war. I tried to remind him of what we had, of our children, our life together, but it was like talking to a wall. He would barely acknowledge me, his mind lost in thoughts of duty and honor. Every conversation revolved around the army, about what he had seen and done. I started to feel like I was no longer his wife, but a stranger in his life. It hurt deeply. I wanted to remind him of the family we had, to remind him of what was important, but it felt impossible. He wasn't the man who had married me. That man had been loving, attentive, and present. This man was a shadow of that person. I couldn't even recognize him anymore. And every day that passed, I felt more and more like I was losing him to a world that had no place for me. It had started with a knife, a few tactical gadgets, and some books. But soon, his obsession with military gear escalated. He began purchasing more weapons, guns, rifles, ammunition. The walls of our home, once adorned with family pictures and happy memories, were now lined with metal, cold and unfeeling. He spoke of protection and preparedness, but the more he bought, the more I felt a sense of dread. He would spend hours in the basement, cleaning and polishing his weapons, organizing them into neat rows. The kids would ask questions, but he would brush them off, telling them not to touch. His eyes would light up when he talked about them, and I could see the shift in him, a dangerous shift. The man who had once held me close and talked about our future now seemed more interested in preparing for some kind of battle. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the distance between us widening with every new purchase. I tried to talk to him about it, to tell him that I didn't feel safe with all the weapons in the house, but he would get defensive. "It's for our protection," he would say. But I didn't feel protected. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. I had no idea how to stop it, how to get through to him. He was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the changes in him. The tension in the air was palpable. Every time I tried to talk to him, it turned into an argument. I would try to express how much I missed him, how I needed him to be present for the kids, but he would get defensive. "I'm doing this for you," he would say. "I'm doing this for the family." But it didn't feel like that. It felt like he was doing it for himself, for his own obsession with duty and war. He would talk about the honor of serving, about the sacrifices he had made, but I didn't feel honored. I felt abandoned. I felt alone. The kids began to notice the change too. They would ask why Daddy wasn't playing with them, why he wasn't showing up for family events, why he seemed so distant. And every time, I had to come up with excuses. I didn't know what else to say. The man I loved had become a stranger, and the more I tried to fix it, the more he pushed me away. I felt helpless, frustrated, and heartbroken. I was losing him, and I didn't know how to get him back. There was a heaviness in the air, a truth that neither of us could articulate. I would watch him from the kitchen, see him cleaning his weapons, his eyes cold and focused. He no longer smiled, no longer gave me the soft glances he used to. The house had become a shell of its former self. It was like living with someone who was physically there, but emotionally gone. I longed for the days when we would laugh together, when he would surprise me with something sweet. But now, he seemed like a stranger, obsessed with his military life, disconnected from everything that used to matter. I tried to tell myself it was just a phase, that he would snap out of it. But as weeks turned into months, I realized that this wasn't a phase. This was the man he had become, and that realization cut deeper than any argument. The kids missed him, too. Our son kept asking when Daddy would play catch with him again, or when he could show him how to ride his bike. And our daughter, so used to her father's warm embraces, began to pull away, not knowing how to approach a man who had become a shadow of himself. I felt helpless. I tried to keep the family together, to stay positive, but it was becoming harder to keep the smile on my face. The unspoken truth between us was clear. He was no longer the person I had married, and I was no longer the person he wanted. The love we once had felt like a distant memory, fading with each passing day. One evening, After yet another quiet dinner where he barely spoke, I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. "Where is the man I married? The man who used to love us? You're not the same." He looked at me, his eyes hard, but there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Pain. You wouldn't understand," he said quietly. "You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what I've been through." His words hit me like a slap, but I didn't back down. "I do understand. I understand that you've changed, that you're not here with us anymore." He looked away, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, might let me in. But instead, he stood up abruptly. "I'm doing what I have to do. You wouldn't get it." The words felt like a final blow. I watched as he walked away, retreating into his own world once more. That night, I sat in our empty living room, the weight of everything crashing down on me. My heart ached, not just for the man he had become, but for the life we had lost. I had tried so hard to keep things together, to make him see the family we still had, but I was losing him in ways I didn't know how to stop. The breakdown wasn't just mine. It was both of ours. He had broken something inside of me, and I had broken something inside of him. As the weeks went by, I noticed he spent even more time alone. His evenings were consumed by his military books, his research on weapons, his thoughts on strategy. He barely interacted with the kids. They were growing frustrated, confused by their father's silence. They would ask me, "Why is Daddy always in his room? Why won't he play with us?" My heart broke each time I had to come up with an excuse. "He's tired," I'd say. "He's thinking about work." But I knew the truth. He wasn't tired. He wasn't thinking about work. He was consumed by something else, something I couldn't reach. I tried to approach him, tried to talk to him about his withdrawal, but he would shut me out. His responses were curt, distant, and always followed by a retreat into solitude. It was as though he was preparing for something I couldn't understand. And the more he withdrew, the more isolated I became. Our conversations were empty, hollow. His eyes, once warm and full of love, were now empty, filled with thoughts I would never be able to share in. I tried to hold on to the hope that we could work through this, that we could find a way back to each other, but every day, it felt like he was slipping further away. The man who once held my hand and promised me a future was now a ghost, and I didn't know how to bring him back. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark, reflecting on everything that had happened. The man I had once loved was gone. It wasn't just the weapons or the army. It was something deeper. He had changed in a way I didn't understand, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach him anymore. He was consumed by his new identity, and I was left on the outside, watching helplessly as the person I had married faded into nothing. I realized then that I had been holding on to a ghost, someone who no longer existed. The realization hit me like a wave. I had hoped that if I tried hard enough, if I gave him enough space, he would come back to me. But that wasn't going to happen. The man I had married wasn't coming back, and in that moment, I had to make a choice. Could I continue living in this cold, empty space with a man who no longer saw me, or did I have to walk away and find a way to heal? It wasn't an easy choice, but I knew it was the right one. I had to let go. I had to stop waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to take back my life. Letting go wasn't easy. It felt like I was walking away from everything I had known, the life we had built together, the family we had created. But in the end, I had no choice. The man I had loved so deeply was gone, replaced by someone who was no longer part of my world. The hardest part was realizing that I couldn't fix him. I couldn't bring him back to the man he once was. He had chosen his path, and it no longer included me. I still loved him, in a way, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for someone who wasn't there anymore. The kids and I started to rebuild our lives, slowly finding joy in the small things again. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I felt a little stronger. I knew that moving on was the right thing to do, even if it meant letting go of the love I had once known. It was time for me to find my own path, to create a new life for myself and for my children. And though the pain would linger, I knew I could survive. I had to. The days after I finally decided to let go felt like walking through fog. There were moments of clarity where I knew the decision was right, but there were also moments where the weight of it all pressed down on me. How had things gotten this far? How had the man I once knew, my partner, my love, become so distant? But the longer I lived with my decision, the more I realized it was the only way forward. There was no point in clinging to something that no longer existed. The kids adjusted quicker than I expected. They had questions, of course, but I kept the answers simple. Daddy needs to focus on himself right now, I would say, and that was all they needed to hear. I was learning, too, how to focus on myself. The months of emotional turmoil had drained me, but I was starting to breathe again. I joined a support group for spouses of military veterans, and talking to other women who understood what I was going through helped more than I could have imagined. I had spent so much time blaming myself for what had happened, thinking that maybe I could have done more, but they helped me realize that sometimes people change in ways that we can't control, and sometimes we have to let them go. There were nights when the house felt too quiet. The kids were adjusting, but I could see the sadness in their eyes. They missed their father, even if he wasn't the same man he used to be. They asked about him often, and every time. My heart broke just a little more. But I knew I had to be strong for them. I couldn't let them see me crumble. One night, after tucking them into bed, I sat alone in the living room, looking around at the emptiness. The house, which used to be filled with laughter and the noise of everyday life, now felt hollow. The kids had their own lives, their own activities, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I missed the family we had been, the way everything felt right when we were together. But that family was gone now, and I had to accept that. The silence of the house echoed louder than I ever thought it could. I wanted to reach out to someone, to tell them how lost I felt, but I didn't know who to turn to anymore. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, just the slow process of rebuilding. As the weeks went by, I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. I started reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with over the years. I began taking time for myself, going on walks, reading, finding little moments of joy. I even started volunteering at the local shelter. The small acts of kindness helped me rediscover pieces of myself that I had forgotten. I wasn't the person I had been before, the carefree wife and mother who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. But I was learning to be someone new. The woman who had loved deeply, lost everything, and was now finding her way back. I found strength I never knew I had. It wasn't easy, but with each day, the weight of the past started to feel a little lighter. I wasn't sure where my journey would take me, but I was starting to believe in the possibility of happiness again. I could feel a glimmer of hope, and for the first time in a long time, it felt real. The kids were growing, and it was bittersweet to watch. Our son, who had once been so close to his father, was now learning to navigate the world without that connection. He had become more independent, more reserved. There were times when I could see the sadness in his eyes when he thought about his dad. He didn't understand why his father had pulled away, and I didn't have the answers to give him. But I did my best to be there for him, to show him that it was okay to feel lost, but it was also okay to find new paths. Our daughter, on the other hand, was more vocal about missing her father. She would draw pictures of their old adventures and leave them on the fridge, hoping he would see them. I tried to make things easier for her, telling her that her father still loved her, even if he wasn't around as much. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. I couldn't replace the bond they had once shared. They were learning to adjust, but the pain of it all was still there, simmering beneath the surface. I wished I could shield them from the hurt, but I knew I couldn't. All I could do was be there for them, and hope they would find their own healing. It had been several months since I last saw him. I had made peace with the fact that he wasn't coming back, that he had chosen his path, and that I couldn't force him to return to the man he had been. But one day, unexpectedly, I saw him. I was at the grocery store with the kids when I turned a corner and saw him standing by the produce section, his back to me. My heart stopped. There he was, taller than I remembered, but with that same distant expression on his face. It was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything I had lost. I froze, not knowing what to do. The kids didn't notice him right away, but I could feel their energy shift, like they sensed something was different. He didn't see us at first, and for a moment, I debated walking away, just leaving without saying a word. But then, as if on instinct, I walked up to him. "Hi," I said softly. He turned around, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Hi," he said, his voice distant, cold. I could tell he hadn't expected to see me. He looked at the kids and then back at me. "How are you?" he asked, though it sounded more like an obligation than genuine concern. "We're fine," I said, forcing a smile. "The kids are doing well." There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of all the years between us. Finally, I said, "I hope you're doing okay." He nodded slowly, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, he might say something more. But instead, he turned and walked away without another word. And that was it. The briefest encounter, but it left me feeling more lost than ever. I thought I would feel something: relief, anger, closure, after seeing him again. But instead, I felt a quiet sadness. The person I had hoped would come back to me was gone, replaced by someone I didn't know. The life we had shared was over, and there was no going back. But that moment, as brief and insignificant as it seemed, was also a turning point for me. I realized that I didn't need his approval or his love to move forward. I had spent so long waiting for him to come back, but now I knew that I had to build a new life on my own terms. The kids were growing, I was growing, and there was a whole world out there for us to explore. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready to face it. And with that, a sense of peace settled over me. The past was gone, but the future was still ours to create. As the months passed, I found myself returning to old hobbies and interests that had been pushed aside for far too long. I had always loved painting, but somewhere along the way, I had forgotten about it. Now, with the space to breathe and think clearly, I began to pick up a paintbrush again. The act of creating, of letting my thoughts and emotions flow onto the canvas, was therapeutic. It gave me a sense of control, of connection to something beautiful. At first, my work was simple, abstract splashes of color, but slowly, I began to refine my technique. It felt good to rediscover a part of myself that had been dormant for so long. I even started sharing my art with a small local group of fellow artists. The validation I received, not just from their praise but from seeing my own growth, was a revelation. It was a reminder that I still had something inside me that could shine, even in the darkest of times. I wasn't just the wife of a man who had disappeared. I was me, an individual with talents, passions, and the ability to build a life beyond the one I had known. As much as I was healing, I knew the kids needed time to process everything too. It was hard to watch them struggle with their feelings, especially when it came to their father. They had both been so attached to him, and now they were faced with the reality that he was no longer part of their daily lives. My son had begun talking more openly about missing him, asking when Daddy would come back. I tried to explain as gently as I could, without adding too much confusion, that sometimes people change and that we had to focus on making our family strong again, even if it was just the three of us. My daughter, on the other hand, would often draw pictures of their old adventures, tears often streaking her artwork. I never knew what to say when she asked, "Why can't Daddy be like he was before?" I couldn't lie to her, and I certainly couldn't explain the complexities of her father's mental shift. Instead, I focused on creating a loving, nurturing home, making sure they felt secure and supported. We did things together, baking cookies, taking trips to the park, and celebrating small victories like good grades and accomplishments. Little by little, their smiles began to return, though I knew there was still a sadness that lingered beneath the surface. The healing would take time, but for now, we were moving forward together as a family of three. One evening, while I was at a coffee shop working on a new painting, I ran into Sarah, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She had heard through mutual acquaintances about my situation, and when we reconnected, I was surprised by how much she understood. She had gone through her own painful divorce a few years back, and her words were both comforting and empowering. "You're stronger than you think," she told me, offering a smile that spoke volumes. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but this is just a chapter. You've got a whole book to write." She had been where I was, feeling lost, like the life she had planned was suddenly turned upside down. But seeing her now, with a new job, new friends, and a renewed sense of self, gave me hope. We talked for hours, catching up on life, and I realized that maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. I could still make new connections, find new sources of support, and create a future that didn't have to be defined by what I had lost. The past didn't have to dictate my future. And Sarah's words stayed with me for days afterward. She had given me a glimpse of the person I could become, someone who could stand tall, even in the face of loss. A few months later, I decided to take a leap. I had always wanted to return to work, but after becoming a stay-at-home mom and focusing on my family, I hadn't thought much about a career. But now, with my kids a little older and more independent, I was ready to take that step. I started by applying for part-time jobs that would allow me to ease back into the workforce while still being present for my children. After a few interviews, I found a position at a local art gallery that felt like the perfect fit. It wasn't just about the paycheck. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under the weight of my responsibilities. The first day I walked into the gallery, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. But as the hours passed, I realized how much I had missed being out in the world, interacting with people, and contributing to something bigger than just my own family. I threw myself into my work with passion, learning about the art industry and discovering new artists, while also building relationships with colleagues. It felt like a rebirth, a chance to prove to myself that I could thrive outside of my previous identity. And in those moments of triumph, I began to see the potential of my life unfolding in new and unexpected ways. One Saturday afternoon, as I was returning from a walk with the kids, we saw him. He was standing by the driveway, his military uniform on, a bag slung over his shoulder. My heart skipped a beat. After all these months, I hadn't expected him to come back, not in this way. I wasn't sure what to say, what to feel. He was still wearing that same distant expression, though there was something in his eyes that seemed different, softer, more vulnerable. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice had a gentleness I hadn't heard in a long time. I looked down at the kids, who were quietly observing from the porch. My son's eyes were wide, uncertain of how to react. My daughter clung to my side, her gaze fixed on her father. I nodded, silently asking him to follow me to the backyard. As we sat down, he spoke, his words slow and careful. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About you and the kids. And what I've done." I felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and a sliver of hope. Was this real? Was he really trying to apologize, to make amends? For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to say. But I listened. And I knew that whatever happened next, it would take time for both of us to process and heal. Even after that conversation, I couldn't rush to conclusions. It wasn't enough to hear words, no matter how heartfelt they seemed. I had spent so much time waiting for him to come back, but I knew now that I couldn't return to the past. The past had been full of joy, but it had also been filled with pain. The journey ahead was going to take time. Time to rebuild trust. Time to see if he could be the man I once knew. I had come a long way in my own healing, and I wasn't sure if I could go back to a life where I was waiting for someone to change. Still, a small part of me wanted to believe that redemption was possible, that he could become the father and husband we had once known. But I also knew that I had to protect myself, protect the children. The road ahead would be long, and I couldn't rush it. It would require patience, understanding, and the willingness to face the truth of who we had both become. We weren't the same people we had been when we first met, and that was something we both had to accept. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, but I knew that no matter what happened, I had already taken the first steps toward a life of my own. The days after his visit felt strange, like the calm before a storm, or perhaps the beginning of something new, but I couldn't place it. We didn't talk much at first. I was still processing everything, and so was he. I didn't expect him to come back and immediately be the husband and father he once was. I didn't even know if that was possible anymore. But the fact that he had shown up, acknowledged his mistakes, and expressed a desire to change, it was a step. A tiny one, but it was a step. I kept my expectations low. If anything, I needed to protect my heart, to guard against being disappointed again. The kids were still confused, unsure of what to make of it all. They didn't fully understand why he had been gone for so long, but they were beginning to ask more questions about the past. "Why was Daddy so different?" my son asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have the answers for him. "Sometimes people change, honey," I said, doing my best to keep it simple. "But that doesn't mean we stop loving them." And that was true, I thought. I still loved him, but I also knew that love wasn't enough. We needed more than just words. We needed actions. So, we waited. I waited for him to prove that he could be the man he said he wanted to be. It wasn't easy, but with time, I began to see small changes in him. He seemed more present when he visited, more aware of the kids' needs. But whether that was enough to rebuild our family, I couldn't say. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding a family, it wasn't a straight line. There were moments when it seemed like everything was falling back into place, and then there were moments when I felt like I was holding on to the fragments of a broken dream. The kids were still adjusting to the idea of having their father back in their lives, even if it was in a limited capacity. My son had become more withdrawn, retreating into his room after visits. My daughter, though excited to see her father, seemed to sense the distance between them. She still made him drawings, but there was a sadness in her art, as if she knew things could never go back to how they were. It was hard for me, too. I wanted to believe that everything could be fixed, that the man I had married, the father of my children, could return to us. But there were too many scars, too much history that couldn't be erased with a few nice words. He would call more often, send texts to check in, but every interaction still felt so distant, like he was living in a world that was separate from ours. I wanted him to be part of our daily lives, but I wasn't sure if I could ever trust him fully again. Each day brought new challenges, challenges that were more internal than external. Could we, as a family, truly heal? Or were we doomed to live in a state of permanent uncertainty? It wasn't until one quiet evening that I felt a breakthrough. The kids were already in bed, and I was sitting on the couch, painting once again, when he called. It was late, and I hadn't expected him to reach out. His voice on the other end was tentative, almost nervous. "Can we talk?" he asked. I hesitated. I had learned by now to guard my emotions, to protect myself. But something in his voice made me listen. "Of course," I replied. He came over later that night. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had in the months since his return. For the first time in a long while, he spoke honestly about the things that had changed him, about his experiences in the army, and the struggle he had been facing with post-traumatic stress. "I wasn't just lost," he said quietly. "I was broken, and I didn't know how to come back to you." The vulnerability in his words hit me harder than I expected. I realized in that moment how much pain he had been carrying, how much he had been trying to shield us from. He wasn't the man I had known, but he was still a man worth loving, a man worth fighting for, if he was willing to fight for himself. The walls between us began to crumble that night, piece by piece, as we talked through the darkness. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't an instant fix, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like there was a chance. The days following that conversation were filled with difficult but necessary steps. He started seeing a therapist to help him process the trauma he had experienced. It wasn't an overnight fix. He had to work through things at his own pace, and sometimes it felt like there were more setbacks than progress. But he was trying, and that was something. For me, it was still a challenge to let go of my anger, to forgive him fully for the emotional distance he had placed between us. I knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and that I could still hold him accountable for the hurt he caused. But I also knew that forgiveness was part of healing, not just for him, but for me, too. I started attending therapy myself, to work through the pain of feeling abandoned and neglected. The more I spoke about it, the more I realized that I had been holding on to so much resentment, and that letting go of that burden was the only way forward. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was back at square one, unsure if I was doing the right thing. But I was determined to rebuild, to create a life that wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. And slowly, with each day, each conversation, each small step, we started healing. One of the most difficult aspects of this journey was watching the kids try to rebuild their trust in their father. They wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, but they had been hurt too. My son, in particular, had become more guarded. He had always been close to his dad, but now he wasn't sure what to expect. He had grown used to the idea of us as a family of three, and the thought of his father being around again felt like a disruption to the world he had come to know. My daughter, though more eager to reconnect, was often hesitant, sensing that there were still cracks in their relationship. I encouraged them both to express their feelings, to talk about what they missed and what they were afraid of. We had family sessions with a therapist, working through the emotions we hadn't addressed before. It was a long road. There were moments when it felt like we were making progress, and then moments when everything seemed to fall apart. But we kept going, step by step, doing the hard work of rebuilding our family, piece by piece. And while the future was still uncertain, I knew one thing. We were learning to live in the present, to embrace what we had, and to move forward together. As much as I was working to rebuild my family, I also realized that part of my healing process was learning to let go of the anger, of the past, and even of expectations. There was a moment when I had to accept that not everything could be fixed in the way I imagined. Not every relationship would return to its original state, and not every hurt could be undone. Letting go of these illusions was freeing. It gave me the space to live fully in the present and allowed me to look at my husband, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. He wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect him to be. But he was trying, and that effort had to mean something. I also had to let go of the pressure I put on myself to make everything work. I was only human, and it was okay to feel uncertain, to take things one day at a time. There were still moments of doubt, when the weight of the past felt overwhelming, when I questioned whether this was the right path forward. But with each step, I learned to trust the process, to trust myself, and to trust that no matter what happened, I would be okay. One unexpected benefit of this entire journey was the way it brought me closer to other people. I had always kept my struggles close to my chest, feeling like I needed to handle everything alone. But now, I was learning that I didn't have to. The friendships I had neglected for so long began to flourish again. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom had been through similar situations. Sarah, who had been there for me before, continued to be a source of strength. We shared our struggles, our triumphs, and our doubts. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in this. There were also new bonds forming, people I met at work, people in my therapy group. We all had our scars, but we were finding ways to heal together. It wasn't just about family anymore. It was about community, about realizing that you don't have to face everything alone, that there are people who understand and support you. It gave me a sense of peace, knowing that I could lean on others and that they could lean on me in return. Together, we were all finding ways to heal. As the months passed, things began to find a new rhythm. It was different, but it was ours. The kids were still adjusting, but they were beginning to trust again, little by little. My son started coming out of his shell, sharing more with his father, even if it was just about school or friends. My daughter was more open with her feelings, sometimes even asking to spend time alone with her dad. I watched their bond grow slowly, with cautious optimism. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what it used to be, but it was something. And I had to believe that it was enough for now. As for me, I was finding peace in the quiet moments. I had always been so busy taking care of everyone else that I had forgotten how important it was to care for myself. I started to prioritize my own well-being, taking walks, reading, painting. I still had moments of sadness, moments when I wished things were different. But those moments were fewer now. I had come to terms with the fact that the family I had envisioned years ago wasn't the family we had today. And that was okay. We were still a family in our own way, and that was enough. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table with my husband after dinner, we had a conversation that felt different. It was light, unhurried. He asked about my day, about the kids, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't done in a long time. For the first time, it felt like we were communicating, not as two strangers trying to find their way back to each other, but as two people who were genuinely trying to rebuild something real. I noticed the way he listened, how he made an effort to remember the little details of my life, the things I had stopped sharing out of habit. It felt like a small but significant shift. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for us after all. The path ahead was still uncertain, but that glimmer of hope was enough to keep moving forward. We had both been through so much, and there were no guarantees. But as I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in so long, I realized that we both deserved a chance to heal together. The road would be long, but we had taken the first step, and sometimes that was all it took. One afternoon, I overheard my son talking to his dad as they played video games together. "You know, I miss this," he said. "Just hanging out with you." My heart swelled with emotion. It was a simple moment, but it was everything. He hadn't been able to say that before, not without hesitation. To hear him say it now, so openly, was a sign that things were moving in the right direction. My daughter, too, had started to ask for one-on-one time with her father. She would often invite him to watch her dance or to help her with her homework. These were the small victories, the quiet triumphs that told me they were healing. They were learning to trust again. And though it wouldn't be an easy road, these moments reminded me of why we were fighting so hard. Our family wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And we were doing the work, slowly, carefully, but steadily. I had learned to stop looking for instant fixes, and instead, I focused on the little moments of connection. They were enough. The more time passed, the more I realized that the joy I had lost was beginning to return. It wasn't a loud, dramatic comeback. It wasn't fireworks or big, sweeping gestures. It was quieter, subtler. It was the laughter in the kitchen when we made pancakes together on a Sunday morning. It was the way we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set and sharing stories about our day. It was the feeling of my husband's hand on mine as we walked to the car, not as strangers, but as partners. And though I couldn't say that everything had been fixed, I could say that we had found a new kind of happiness. It wasn't the life I had imagined years ago, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was enough. As time passed, there were moments when I realized that we were rediscovering a kind of intimacy that we had long lost. It wasn't just physical, though that part had its own place, but emotional. We were starting to communicate without fear, without hesitation. I found myself opening up more to him, talking about my dreams, my fears, things that had been buried under the weight of everything that had happened. He, too, began to share more of himself with me. Things he had never said before, things I had long wondered about. I learned about the fears he had when he was deployed, the things he had seen and done that haunted him still. I had no idea how heavy those experiences were for him, how deeply they had affected him. But hearing him speak about it, his vulnerability, was a gift. It allowed me to understand him in a way I hadn't before. We spent evenings just talking, asking each other questions, reconnecting in ways that felt so natural, so necessary. Our relationship was no longer about trying to get back to what it had been. It was about creating something new, something real. And though it wasn't perfect, there were still bumps along the way. I could feel the love between us growing again, slowly but steadily. It was like we were both learning how to love each other for the first time again, in a way that was deeper, more honest. As we continued on this journey, I started to see our family differently. We weren't just the family we had once been, the one frozen in time before his deployment. We had grown, individually and together. We were a new kind of family, a family forged from the fire of pain, but also one shaped by resilience, by hope. The kids were stronger, more understanding of the complexities of life and of their father's struggles. They had seen him at his lowest, and they had seen him try to rise from it. In their own way, they had begun to heal as well. My son was no longer withdrawn. He had started opening up more to me, sharing his thoughts and feelings in ways he hadn't done before. My daughter, too, was more open, more trusting. Watching them interact with their father now was bittersweet. There were moments of hesitation, but also moments of pure connection, moments that reminded me of what was possible, what we could still have. We were a family, but we were different now, stronger, wiser, more compassionate. And though the past could never be erased, we were learning how to live in the present, to embrace what we had, and to move forward together. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. One thing that had become clear to me in all this was the importance of embracing imperfection. Our family wasn't perfect. My marriage wasn't perfect. The kids weren't perfect. And that was okay. For so long, I had chased after an idea of perfection, an image of the perfect family, the perfect life. But I realized that perfection was a myth. The beauty of life, of love, was in its imperfections. It was in the messiness, the moments of doubt, the moments of joy and sorrow. It was in the small victories, the everyday moments that we sometimes overlook. My husband and I, we would never go back to what we once had, but maybe that was okay. What mattered now was what we could create together. What mattered was the effort we put in, the way we loved, and the way we grew. In that realization, I found peace. I found acceptance. And I found that, despite everything, I was finally able to love my life for what it was. Not for what it could have been, but for what it had become. With each passing day, it became clearer to me that moving forward was less about leaving the past behind and more about finding a way to integrate it into our lives. The past had shaped us, both the good and the bad, and it would always be a part of us. But we didn't have to be defined by it. We didn't have to let it control our future. Slowly, we began to build new memories, to create new traditions. We started taking weekend trips as a family, exploring new places, laughing, and making new memories together. The kids loved it. They loved seeing their father more involved, more present. It felt like we were all starting over, but this time with the benefit of our past lessons. I began to feel a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. We were no longer just surviving. We were living, truly living. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. It was still uncertain, but now it felt like it was something we could face together. One thing I hadn't realized until recently was that, in the chaos of everything that had happened, I had lost touch with my own dreams. I had focused so much on trying to hold everything together, trying to fix things for everyone else, that I had forgotten to dream for myself. But as we rebuilt our family, I started to rediscover my own passions. I began to take more time for myself, to paint, to write, to explore things that I had once loved but had set aside. I joined a local book club and started taking art classes again. It felt like I was finally starting to live for me, not just for my family. My husband supported me in this, encouraging me to pursue the things that made me happy. And it felt good. It felt right. I realized that part of the healing process wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but also about rediscovering the parts of myself that I had neglected. In nurturing those parts, I was better able to show up for my family, more whole, more fulfilled. And though I still had a long way to go, I knew that I was on the right path. Forgiveness had always been a difficult concept for me. For a long time, I didn't think I could forgive him for what he had put us through, the abandonment, the emotional distance. But slowly, as I watched him struggle, as I saw his efforts to change, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about condoning his actions. It was about freeing myself from the burden of resentment. It was about letting go of the anger that had kept me tethered to the past. Forgiveness didn't mean I had to forget. It didn't mean I had to pretend that everything was okay. It meant I was choosing to move forward, to allow us both the space to grow and heal. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it was also one of the most freeing. In forgiving him, I was also forgiving myself for not knowing how to fix everything, for being afraid, for holding on to pain longer than I needed to. It was a lesson in letting go, in trusting that the future could be better if I allowed it to be. Looking back, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for everything that had happened, the good, the bad, and everything in between. We had been through so much, and though the journey had been painful, it had also been transformative. We had learned to heal, to forgive, and to love in a deeper, more authentic way. Our family was stronger than it had ever been. My husband and I had found a new kind of intimacy, a new kind of partnership. The kids had learned to trust again, to love unconditionally. And as a family, we had found peace. The future still held its challenges, but I no longer feared it. I saw it as full of possibility, a future that we could create together, a future where we continued to grow, to heal, and to love. We weren't perfect, but we were whole, and that was enough. We had come so far, and I knew that, no matter what the future held, we would face it together.